Coming to university, I thought that I was a Christian and that I knew who Jesus was because of the stories that I had heard as a child. In the first week of university, I started chatting to a girl standing outside the DSU in a green t-shirt, and she asked me who I thought Jesus was. The question floored me, and I realised that I actually had no idea. So she invited me along to her church, and to be honest, I was too awkward to say no. So I went along, and it became even more apparent by the passages that we read from the Bible and the people that I met, that they believed and had such hope in someone that I didn't know. The same girl later messaged me and asked me if I wanted to go for a coffee and read a bit of the Bible with her. I said I would go, but I was so embarrassed because I didn't actually own a Bible, and so I immediately ran into town and bought one, and it was one of the best purchases that I've ever made. I started to read the Bible with her every week and on my own, and God, through His Word, helped me to truly understand who Jesus was. I knew that I was so sinful and had rejected God my whole life, and yet despite that, God so loved me that He sent Jesus into the world to die on the cross and to rise again from the dead so that I could have a relationship with Him. I couldn't believe that God was offering to save me from the sin that I could never get rid of myself, and all I had to do was repent and put my trust in Jesus. As I have read more about God's promise for the future, I've realised why the Christians that I had met had such certain hope, because God in Jesus had made a way for me to be saved from my sins and look forward to eternal life with Him as my Father.
Hello guys, welcome to the final evening of Vision. We're so glad to have you all with us, whether this is your first time at Vision or you've been with us for the entire week. Vision is a space for exploring the person of Jesus Christ and grappling with some of life's biggest questions. I'm Sam, a second-year engineering student at Collingwood.
And I'm Abby. I actually graduated in 2018, so I am living evidence that there is life after graduation. But back in the day, I studied history at Trevs. We got any Trevs? Come on. Yeah, come on. I actually came to faith while I was at university, and I'm now training in ministry at a church in Durham. All week, we've been asking some of life's biggest questions, and tonight we've got the ultimate coming up. We're going to ask, what do we do? What happens after death?
But first, a few practical points. There are 6 fire exits on this site, 2 either side of the stage, 2 at the back of the marquee, and 2 in the entrance area. If there is a fire, please look out for the people in vision jumpers and do as they say. That would be great.
Likewise, if you're in need of any first aid, again, keep your eye out for a vision jumper. They'll do their best to help you. If you find any time in the night that you're in need of the loo, we have some very practical and wonderful facilities out the back, just around the side of the marquee, and we got some portaloos for you, so they're just great.
So this evening, we're going to be hearing from Paul. He's going to be sharing his testimony of how he came to encounter Jesus. We're going to also be hearing from Hamish, who's been running these evening sessions. He'll be speaking about the resurrection of Jesus and what it means for us. So guys, would you please welcome Hamish up to the stage?
Hi.
Hello, good evening.
Thank you. You too. We have been asking you questions all week, some of
Yes,
which have been
indeed.
quite awkward at points, haven't they?
They have, and I mean, if you've been here like every night, all I can do is apologise for the sheer volume of silly information you now know about me.
Well, we're going to start with another one.
Yeah, no,
Sorry.
indeed.
So when you were a Ben, when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
A rugby player.
A rugby player?
A rugby player.
I can see that, yeah. You're quite towering.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wasn't this tall when I was a kid, though. So, like, I was, like, historian. It's all right. No, I mean that's as a historian as well. No, I was tall, but yeah.
Were you only good at rugby?
I was all right.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. And now for the slightly more serious one. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
But I suppose we're looking at kind of life after death tonight, at
Yeah.
the possibility of resurrection. And I don't know, as a young person myself, 22, there's a sense of invincibility, a sense that death will never come. But there are certain points in life where actually that becomes a reality. We face up to that. So I suppose the question I have for you is, have you ever had a near-death experience?
I mean, it somewhat dovetails actually with the question about rugby. So I did genuinely want to be a rugby player. I was genuinely all right. I was playing quite a lot. And when I was 17, I was towards the back end of a rugby match. I was getting up off the ground, we think. I can't remember, because what happened was someone clattered into my back as I was getting up, drove my head into the ground, and my body came up and over the top. I was on the pitch for 45 minutes. It was as foul a day as Scotland could create, chucking with rain. My school was kind of up on the edge of the Highlands, so a wee bit remote. So 45 minutes for the ambulance to come. And I do vividly remember having the accumulated kit of 4 rugby teams, us and then the second 15, sort of piled on top of me just to try and keep me warm, but they couldn't move me. Right side of my body was numb, as in like paralyzed. I couldn't move my arm or my leg, and my vision was going. And thankfully I got to the hospital. Turned out that I had torn the edge of my spinal column between my C5 and C6 vertebra, if that means anything to you. One of the great advantages of rugby is lots of injuries, because it means that you get to know your anatomy really quite well for someone who's not a medic. But I'd had a nick in the corner of the spinal column, so I had quite a lot of bleeding within that really critical part of the body. And subsequently, the doctor who treated me, who was involved with kind of sports injuries, said that another 5 pounds per square inch of pressure, he reckoned, and my neck would have snapped. Or if I'd been 10 years older and that little bit stiffer. So I suppose me today would have been a goner. So yeah, that was as near to death as I've come. I was 5 weeks in hospital. 2 of those weeks I was flat on my back. And then another 2 weeks at home in a stiff neck brace, and then back to school in a soft collar. And that was a really major turning point in my own life. I was your, I suppose, stereotypical 17-year-old rugby boy. So not necessarily a pretty sight in some ways. I was a Christian. I, though, was very much living for myself in the world of sport. If any of you have ever been to a school where sports is a big deal, if you play for like the top team in school, you're quite a sort of big name in school. If you're playing for anything outside of that, then it's not great for your ego, and certainly it wasn't for mine. And actually that kind of instant face-to-face with the fact that could have been me in a wheelchair at best, or at worst I could have died, was a moment of real kind of pause and a genuine opportunity for me to take stock of what I wanted to do with my life. So thankfully I didn't need to make a decision. Rugby was taken off the table, and that really in some ways was like the first domino that led me to stand in a windy marquee and talk to people about Jesus. So
Great, thank you for sharing.
great, not at all.
Great.
Is that over
We'll
to me?
leave you to it.
Brilliant, super, thanks guys. Let me invite, without any further ado, Paul onto the stage. Paul, please come and join me if you would.
Thank you, Matt.
Sit down. Grand. Now, Paul, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Durham, although you can genuinely say that in terms of the region, you are the local in the room and we're all the visitors. Is that right?
Yeah.
Tell us where you were born and where you grew up.
I was originally from Consett.
Okay.
Little village, Ledgate, next to Consett.
So Ledgate next to Consett. Now, I know that for the average Durham student, kind of the walk up to Gilesgate feels like the end of the world. So Consett is a few miles outside Durham. Such places exist.
Highest point.
Highest point. It is indeed. And just give us a wee bit of a flavour of what life was like for you growing up, Paul.
Well, I went to a Catholic school. Sorry, I'll go back a little bit. I jump about a bit. So as I'm speaking my testimony, as our class it as I'm questioned, I might jump about a bit. My life was hectic, so my testimony might be. But I just hope God touches you through what I've got to say. I hope he removes the scales from your eyes, because Jesus is the answer. That's hopefully my testimony gives you that. As a child, Mum and Dad was brought up, had a good life, caring family, loving family. Up to a 7-year-old, then my mum and dad separated. We'd moved off to other areas, but ended up moving back to where my mum was originally from. And at that age, I thought I had to care for my mum. As a young child, at 8-year-old, thinking I had to look after her. So you do what you do, don't you? Thinking you're a man at 8-year-old. And that carried on right through my life, thinking I had to look after everybody. And anybody around us who suffered, basically I would put myself in their place and try to take their suffering and me deal with it. that was the beginning.
Okay. And you mentioned before, backing up a bit, that you were going to a Roman Catholic school.
Yeah.
You were an altar boy in the Catholic school.
Yeah.
Do you have a good voice?
Wasn't bad.
Wasn't bad.
Ask our church now, I shout a bit.
After church, an enthusiastic voice. Maybe if you come and ask him nicely afterwards, you might sing you a solo.
Definitely not. I'll empty the place.
I mean, you were being raised there then in something of a sort of religious atmosphere.
Yeah.
But like, what was your view of Christianity? Particularly, what was your view of Jesus at that time?
I believed there was something. I believed in God. I was an altar boy. I served funerals, served weddings, but I was serving them because you got a fiver at the end of it, not because of Jesus being there with us. I knew there was something. I didn't know what. I didn't understand. It was Jesus. So I did what I had to do, going through them things. Seeing people who had Christian lives and seeing something about them back then that I understand now was God.
Okay.
Basically.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess a lot of people might empathise with that, hearing stuff about religion and Christianity specifically by just sort of washing over them. Your mum met someone else after a few years. And so you're a good guy?
Excellent guy.
Excellent. Why do you say that?
He took my mum on and 4 of us. Well, my mum was due my little sister at the time. As I say, don't look at my mum as she'd met somebody else, got pregnant and met him. Her and my dad had separated. My dad had come back for a while. My mum had fell pregnant. My dad had left again. And in that time scale, she met my stepdad, who was basically my mum's partner on a weekend. She used to go out and they used to go at the pictures and that together, as you do when you're young, and go at the pictures and that together. But he took a lot of responsibility on and supported the 4 of us and my mum. He was a bit younger than my mum, but he supported all of us, got a job, good jobs to make sure he was an electrician, made good money to make sure we were looked after, but it was all about us. And he didn't do anything for himself. It was all about us as kids and my mother, and that's all he wanted to do. All he worked for was us. And he took us out of, as my mum was divorced, and that we ended up with nothing, so going from a big, nice life down to nothing, he built us back up and bought our first house, renovated that, bought another house, renovated that, and then basically our home was paid for by the 3rd house. And it was just a totally different world to what I'd been used to as a child. So...
Okay, so you had some stability at home. Then when you got to age 15, life took something of a turn.
Yeah.
And a turn that was going to shape you, it seems, for a good long while. Could you just tell us what the first domino was for you? I mean, I talked about my neck. What was the thing that sent you down a dark path?
The area I was brought up in, there wasn't a lot happening there. For people your age, there wasn't a lot happening. So as a young lad at 15, I got involved with people 20, 21, up-overs basically. And they were smoking dope and things like that, so I got involved in the dope. And basically by the age of 16 coming on to 17, I was a heroin addict. So when people think dope doesn't lead you to other things, people do it at uni. It's a bit of fun. You might be the 1 out of 9 of you, because normally there's 1 out of every 9 their addiction will get. And you might be looking at your friend next to you thinking, that would never be us. Don't think you're more powerful than drugs, because you aren't. You definitely aren't.
So Paul, let me just jump in. You were 15 when you first smoked dope. You're saying you're a heroin addict, which is strong language.
Yeah.
By the time of 17.
Yeah.
I mean, when did you first then use heroin? Can you remember?
16-year-old.
16.
First methadone script by the age of 17.
Right. Okay. How did your mum and your stepdad respond? Did they know?
Were heartbroken. They didn't know, but at 17-year-old, I thought, as you do when you're on drugs, that they had been told, and they were talking to family members about us, and they weren't. So I went in and admitted it to my family, basically, Well, I didn't admit it. I said I wasn't, but you could see all the marks on my arms and things like that I was. So it opened the door to my mum being shattered by it. But by that time, I was addicted.
And I mean, by the time you were 17, you'd had another milestone in life.
I had a son.
You had a son, yeah. And so, what did that look like with a family that was breaking apart? You in the grips of addiction, with a son and a partner. What happened next there?
Well, I looked at it back then through rose-tinted glasses. It wasn't that bad. When you're in it, it doesn't look that bad. Trying to support a family in my own home with me and my partner and a child, thinking I could manage things, thinking I had to look after everything and do everything myself. If it hadn't been for my mum, I wouldn't have got halfway as far as I did, because she supported the partners I was with, the girlfriends I was with, and built my home for me, give us everything I needed. Which, as we go later on in the story, we'll realise was a mistake.
Yeah, okay.
But basically, my family tried the best for us. But I loved my son, I worshipped my partner, but drugs were that powerful. They were more important, and the paths that took us down. I look back now and see what suffering I caused people by me using drugs. Heartbreaking.
Well, it's a dark path, but let's keep going down the path with you. So, addict by 17, partner, son. Jail, right, you beat me to it. Another milestone. What happened there?
Went to jail, sold drugs in there to get what I needed. Sold drugs, bought drugs, used drugs.
What was jail like?
Hell. I could handle myself. I don't say that lightly because it's not what I want you to hear, but I could handle myself, so I could look after myself. But the fear and the being disconnected from the people you love and seeing them once a fortnight, once a month, it's not a good existence. It's a horrible existence. When you see these programs on telly and you see all these lads laughing and carrying on when on the programs, really that isn't what jail is. When they get behind that cell door, jail is you're disconnected from the world. You're disconnected from everything that's important to you. Some people who live on the streets and end up in there, yes, for them, it's a good thing because they've got a roof over their head and 3 square meals a day and nothing to worry about. But when you've got friends and family on the outside who love you and care for you, that's the hard part about being in jail. Yeah, you can stick us in any room and leave us there for 23 and a half hours. It wouldn't bother us. But it would bother us what's happening to the people outside. And because I'm a protective person, you worry about them. When really it should have been me I was worrying about, and me I was looking at, and me I was trying to deal with and put on the right path.
Because you mean that as you were looking out at everyone, you were just carrying on down this destructive kind of spiral?
Yeah.
Because you were in for 15 months, that first sentence. Did that bring about any change in you when you were released?
None. Right. I was an injecting drug user. I'll be open and honest because I should be. I was an injecting drug user. The only thing that changed when I went into jail, I didn't inject drugs because I knew of the diseases that are in there and I didn't. But when I got out, I'd always planned when I was in jail, I would always say to everybody, I won't do it again. Even though I would take tablets and that while I was in jail. But when I get out, I won't pick that needle up again. I won't do it. And within weeks, straight back to the same circle.
And I suppose for someone who's not experienced addiction, that might sound like just a hard thing to wrap their head around. You know, you'd been 15 months not injecting. If you can remember, what was it that drove you back to that way of life?
Guilt. Okay. What you've done to people. If you can go through life, if you get a headache, you would go and pick a paracetamol up to put your headache right. I got a problem, I would go and pick a drug up to take those feelings away, to take the hurt I'd caused other people away. That'll numb me, to get rid of them feelings. And that's what drugs do.
Yeah. And there was quite a lot of hurt to deal with. Your partner and your son had moved on in that sense.
Yeah.
They'd been taken out
Yeah.
of your life.
Yeah.
And when you were 19, you met someone else.
Yeah.
So another partner, but that ultimately led to another jail stint.
Yeah.
Can you just take us through what happened in that phase?
Yeah, I was on moving my new, who was going to be my wife, up from a home in Sheffield. She had 3 children. I took them 3 children on, which was, I didn't look at then, but it was the same path that my stepdad did. So I took 3 children on to support them and do the best I could for them. One thing I will say to people looking at me from the outside world when I was in this, I didn't look like a drug user. I would go out and still make money. I would find ways of keeping things going. We didn't have social services involved. We didn't have anybody else. The only thing I ever had was a drug service. So it wasn't like looking from the outside. My life was mad back then, even though it was. But other people didn't say that.
So you were essentially leading something of a double life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then basically somebody tried to steal the van that I was moving my wife up with. And I found out who it was, and I went and found him. And he got in the van with us, and then basically after that I told him to take the money to my mother, because my mother had paid for the van and the hire of the van, the deposit and that, and I said, go and take the money, because we'd lost that deposit to her by 1 o'clock. And then when I was on my way back from Sheffield, I got a phone call saying the armed response are waiting for you. And I got back to police with guns and everything all over Ledgate waiting for us. I went and bought myself 60 tabs. I was a smoker. I went and bought myself 60 tabs and went and handed myself into the police station, and that was the last I seen of. I got 15 months for that.
Which is, must have been just such a whiplash, because you're coming back up to build a new life, and then instantly you're plunged back into prison. And when you came out this time, your wife was still there.
Yeah.
But then that itself didn't last as life continued down. Again, would you just take us through the pain of that?
Yeah, she didn't realise how bad my drug use was. As I say, looking at us, it didn't look that bad. So when I got out of jail, she'd met us, we'd been together, she'd only been seeing us down in Sheffield, and she moved up to our area. We swapped the house I was in for a bigger house. I came out of jail, she'd done all the house was all sorted, the kids were in school, everything was going well. And I came out of jail, and she then found out within 3 months how bad my drug use was, and tried for years to stop us out of love. She really loved us, her and the kids loved us, but it didn't stop what I was doing. And I wanted to stop. All this time I was running about setting needle exchanges up, doing harm minimisation stuff, working with the National Treatment Agency, working with the DATs, helping other people, getting other people well. And all this time couldn't get myself well.
And particularly that's helping other people who were drugs users, right?
Yeah.
So that double life was in pretty full flow in some ways. She then started to see the signs of drug use in you, like physically, and other people, you told me, were starting to see that too.
Yeah.
For those who aren't familiar with it, certainly that would include me in some ways. Could you just tell us what some of those physical signs were for you, or what they are generally?
My body was starting to give up. My lungs collapsed. Liver was giving up. I ended up with hepatitis C. For me, I was dying. And it went from me looking normal to being that person very fast. Very fast. And then I went to treatment to get myself sorted, because all the time I was trying to sort other people. And I went finally to get myself some help. And I came home and my wife had gone with the 3 kids, and I've never seen her from that day to this. I know they're all right.
No notice, no warning?
Nothing, just came home and the house was empty, gone.
So had that been a sort of like planned intervention? On
for
their
them,
part?
For them, it must have been. They had help from refugees and that were coming in. They'd got me on the bus on a morning to go to Newcastle for treatment. And what I found out is as soon as I left, the vans and that were waiting at the top of the street, came in, emptied the house, and gone. and I came back in the bits that were left. I knew she had the burns, so I went to her friend and said she needs to take the carpet, she needs to empty everything, get the rest of it out, make sure they're all right. It wasn't enough to show my love for them, because I wasn't showing them proper love.
I mean, it must just be hard even remembering this stuff.
It's painful.
Yeah. I mean, can you give us a bit of a window onto just what that did feel like? Because you said that it was guilt and shame that in some ways was driving your use, and then here's
empty, useless,
okay,
worthless, as low as a snake's belly. I couldn't have gone no lower. Everybody around us I hurt. Everybody around us, through seeing what I was doing to myself, I was hurting. Killing my mother through her watching her son destroy himself.
Yeah.
Killing my wife through her watching us destroy myself.
You mentioned your mum there, and you clearly, love her. Could you just tell us a wee bit about what your family involvement was like in terms of your mum, your stepdad, up to this point, what had been the pattern?
My mum did everything for us. Money, she gave us any time she would see us in pain because of the drugs, because drugs are painful, especially heroin. Every time I had none, I would be in agony. So my mum's way of helping us would be giving us money. She didn't know any other way. She wasn't wise on this stuff. She'd never dealt with anything like this before. So she'd give us money. I'd go and get drugs, and then she'd see her son without any pain anymore. And she was doing it because she loved us. She couldn't handle seeing her son roll about on the floor in tears, in agony, hurting that much. She just wanted it to stop. So she would give us money for me to go and either get help, which is a normal view, go and get some help. I'd go and buy drugs to put myself right.
Yeah. Okay. And this period now when your wife had left you, you described it to me earlier almost as like the madness years, where things really started going even further down, if such a thing can be possible.
I didn't give the house up. I was told I had to be out of the house because it was a council house. And basically because I didn't have a family with me anymore, it was a big house. I had to leave, so then I was homeless. My mum stepped in again, and we rented a house right next door to my sister. I know my mum had done that, so my sister was on my doorstep and could see what was going on. But she rented us a big 4-bedroom house next to my sister, which it just went crazy. I just started using a lot more, using anything. If I couldn't get one drug, another drug would do. And it just got to where I was taking cocktails of large amounts of drugs. And when I say large amounts, I don't say that half-heartedly. I'm not saying that to make myself look like I took a lot of drugs. It was anything I could get my hands on to wipe out who I'd become. I didn't want to be who I was, so trying to take myself away from that with anything possible.
And just then a total cycle, like presumably the more you'd inject, the more pain there'd be, and then the more pain there'd be, the more you put in, and down it goes.
Yeah.
I mean, I know this is a really hard thing to ask, but could you describe to us what rock bottom was? Because you hit a particular low point where you just had enough.
Well, I tried to kill myself 3 or 4 times within a few months, and I couldn't even do that successfully. I tried to hang myself on a leather belt, which shouldn't have snapped. This is God. This is where I look back and I know it was God. There's no way it should have snapped. I'm a builder, so I knew how to hang things up. And I hung myself, and the solid brass buckle just came off. And there's no way it should have. It's not natural for that to happen. And I hit the floor. I was devastated because it hadn't worked. Then I injected enough drugs to wipe a field of horses out, and I'm not joking, to wipe a lot of people out. If it would kill 10 people without a problem. And I don't say that half-heartedly. And my family had been told, my mum had met a drugs worker who'd said, it's tough love, you have to cut them off, you can't help them. The only way you're going to help them is by cutting them off. So all my family stayed away from us for 2 years. And I was in the bungalow normally I would get my drugs, I would go in, I would lock the door so nobody could get in the house. And I'd gone in the house, I think I'd forgot to lock the door. I took my drugs, I was in that place, I didn't want to be here anymore. I didn't want to let anybody know that I wanted to kill myself. It was just, you could have flicked a switch and took us out and it's not have existed. That's what I wanted. So I took all this and I was on my kitchen floor, and my cousin had come in who'd never seen us for 2 years and found us, which my heart had stopped. I was gone a bit longer. The oxygen would have cut off to my brain. The ambulance got there, got us round. I woke up in hospital with pipes coming out from us all over, all my family standing round us, and I was devastated. So I ripped all the pipes out of us, jumped off the bed and walked out the hospital, leaving my family standing there to deal with that. I didn't look at it like that at the time, but I was gutted because I'd woke up. I didn't want to be here. I knew I had more pain to come because I'd woke up.
Just worth pausing for a moment. Like, obviously Paul's story is an extraordinary one, pretty extreme one. Very conscious though that those feelings of despair may well be shared by folk in the marquee tonight. In many ways, this is an example of why not to deal with that yourself.
Yeah.
If we can help you, please come and talk, but really encourage you to talk to someone if that is something that you're struggling with, that feeling of hopelessness and despair.
What I would say is how my things are big just meant it took big things to flatten me. Could be the tiniest thing that's getting at you. Don't let it get to a big thing. Speak to people. Speak to people you trust. If you're in churches, speak to church leaders. They're there because they love you. If you're in here tonight and you worry about talking to friends, come and speak to people from church. You aren't judged. You're cared for. You're loved. We're all on one path. And we want to love each other and show each other that love. Don't carry things. Little things grow, the snowball, and end up flattening you and your family and the people you love. It doesn't just have to be the big drugs or the big life that I've had. The tiny things are bad enough.
Okay, thank you for that, Paul. And I mean, clearly even the language you're using there shows that life took a turn, that you're now using language that when you were a boy was just washing over you, and you're speaking of God with great love and emotion.
Yeah.
You're someone who says he knows Jesus. Could you just, for the next couple of minutes, just take us through what changed? I know that a major turning point was meeting some Christian people. Could you take the story from there?
Before I became a Christian, I'd run out of money. Things had started to fall on me. If anybody's heard of Free Cycle, where people put stuff on, you go and pick it up if it's any use to you. I was looking at that to go and pick stuff up to make money to sell it. And two of the people I went to get some bathrooms off were Christians, and they told us about God's love. What Jesus came for, and he came for me. And all my sins didn't matter anymore. He took them to the cross. So all the stuff I felt pain about and that would take me back every now and again, they were telling me it didn't matter. It didn't matter. Jesus has dealt with that for you. And at the time, I was paranoid. I was nervous. There's no way you would have got me sitting here. So this is God for me. The church they were going to, there was only 9 people in. And it's where I needed to be at that time to start to know Jesus. So I went into that little church. They supported me, got me strong enough to where God put 2 other people in my life who were looking for a bigger church. And I went with them to a bigger church. And God really started to work on me to deal with things that were painful. And then at that time, my dad got cancer. I relapsed, and I relapsed for 6 months. That 6 months of relapse was much more painful than all that madness I've spoken about before, because I knew there was an answer, and I knew there was a way out. I couldn't deny anymore that Jesus could get me well and change my life. So it was harder than any other drug use. 6 months I went through it. dealing with my dad's cancer. I moved up closer to him, dealing with my dad's cancer. After 3.5 years, he died. But in that time, I'd thrown myself into being a Christian. I used to walk about with my dad in a wheelchair, telling him about Jesus and what Jesus has done for me. And I think my dad got it. He was starting to say, I'm sorry about admitting things he'd done wrong in the past when he left Mum, and saying he was sorry and just admitting his mistakes as we should. And I think he got an understanding of Jesus. And when he died, I was in the room with him. And the feeling I got when my dad died of comfort was I've been around other people dying. It was a strange feeling of comfort, knowing that he was all right. And it didn't matter. And I loved my dad. I doted on my dad. I would have given anything for him. But I knew he was going to be all right. 7 weeks later, I found out Mum had cancer. What I will say, 5 hours after my dad died, I was in church because I knew where I needed to be. God had surrounded me with a family who cared for us and understood us and wanted to support me through thick and thin, and they have. I was in church, as I say. Then Mum got cancer, so we had to deal with it all again. One thing I will say is Mum didn't accept Jesus, didn't understand Jesus, didn't want to understand Jesus. I can't say for definite, but one thing I will say, and I doted on my mum. You've heard everything she done for us. I loved her. My mum ain't in heaven. She didn't want to know Jesus. On her deathbed, she was telling me, how could I believe in Jesus when she was lying there suffering? As I'm telling her, Mum, this isn't Jesus. And I wasn't hitting her with a Bible. I'm not saying stuff like that. I'm not saying this to sound like be all holy. I was saying this to let her know that she gives her life to Jesus. She's got eternity. If she doesn't, she don't have eternity. And it was painful, but there's nothing I can do about it. What I can do something about it is realise that I don't have to go there, and if my words can stop anybody else or plant a seed so Jesus can grow it in anybody else's life, that's what I have to do now. It's about the souls I can spread the word for souls to be saved, for people to be saved, not the people that I can't do anything about who are gone.
I mean, Paul, clearly it's not like trust in Jesus and life gets all easy. I mean, even here you're explaining about ongoing pain. I mean, just thinking, you've spoken a lot of the guilt and the shame. Obviously now there's grief on top of grief. And you're 36 at this point, I think, when your mum dies, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm 35, and the suffering in your life is just compressed. What did it look like for you to understand who Jesus is in the face of all that hurt? Because to some that might just sound absolutely incomprehensible.
I knew I wasn't alone, and I knew I was all right. And even though my mum and dad were gone, I had a father that weren't going anywhere, and he wasn't. And he'd surrounded us with people who, my mum and dad seen their son well. They seen their son away from the drugs. That was enough for them. They knew I was all right. And I believe I was blessed with a family that's... I've gone through a lot more having to deal with feelings since I've been well than I went through back then. We lost our home. We went into business, had 6 cottages that we were turning to. One of them was our home. We lost all that, which was £500,000 to us, which, when you've heard of where I've come from, was a lot of money. But I wanted to set something up as a charity to help other people out of that money. We lost all that. Now, that pain in the old life, without Jesus, would have took me straight back to drugs. But what I had to do was, the hardest thing I've ever done, and I've still worked on it for a couple of years, was forgiving them people. So that didn't hold me in bitterness that would have took me back, because it's all the anger and resentment and fear and painful stuff that takes me back to where I was. And I don't want that back. And Jesus tells us in the Bible ways not to have that back.
And I mean, you know, it's a life that has lasted for you. Your wife Sarah, who you're mentioning there, is here with us this evening, and some dear friends from a wee bit further north.
Yeah. My wife Sarah was a prison officer, so she used to lock the doors. I'm not saying she did for me, but she would lock the doors of the rooms I was in. And then she went on to social work, and
We should ask Sarah later if she's tempted ever to lock
Oh,
the door.
she's locked a few on us, so that's all right. But to realise, to come from that, to have these type of people in my life and somebody who loves us, who was in two total different worlds. And the friends I've got, there's Dave and Jill at the back, they're like family to us. He's a church leader, but he's like a father to us, who guides me and tells me when I'm going wrong. You can ask them yourself. I don't find that easy. I would rather deal with it my way, but I know I've got to listen and take on board, because other people don't want me going down them paths I used to go down. And they're guiding me in the right direction, and God has put them people in my life for a reason. So God can bless me to be a blessing for others.
Okay. Paul, time has gone. I know that Paul's very willing to stay around at the end. He'd love to talk. If you've got particular questions about his story, please come and ask. I mean, equally, we were talking earlier, if there's anything you're hearing that you think, well, it's just too good to be true, or wishful thinking, I know he'd be really happy to talk. I think you can tell from his words, from his manner, the worst he's going to do these days is give you a hug, and would love to talk that through with you. I've got one final question as we close, though. The life you've led is a very long way from the average Durham student.
Yeah.
And that might be my understatement of the year in some ways. What might you say to anyone who is saying, okay, that sort of faith and hope is good for someone in your sort of scenario, but my problems are different. How might you gently look to counsel someone who it's easy for me to say that to you rather than one of these guys?
Jesus didn't just come and die for me, he came and died for you. Individually, he came and died for you, and he loves you individually, no matter what walk of life you're from, he loves you. I had some big issues, some big horrible things happen in my life, but Jesus helps us deal with the little things on our daily path. In anything that comes up, Jesus blesses us when we get the big things in life, or the big things come along. He blesses us with stuff. And sometimes when we're living in our own way, we don't see that as coming from him. All of it comes from him. Everything that's around you comes from him. So please accept him. He loves you. Anybody who's doubting it, he went to the cross for us. He got battered. Excuse the plain language. He got battered on the way to the cross for you. You as an individual, he was tortured. Forget my pain. That was nothing compared to what Jesus went through. And he went through that and got hung on a cross and died for us. But know the glory, 3 days later, he rose again also for us. So we can have heaven with him. He did that for you. And we can have heaven with him or hell with the devil. That's the reality. We've got two paths. One to heaven or one to hell. And I know which one I want to be on. And I want to see you all in heaven the day we're all there together. And I want to be partying with you when Jesus walks in that room for us. I don't want to see you in hell. And that's the only reason I'm sitting here today. Isn't for me. It's for each one of you to try and let you know that he loves you, man. He loves you. If he could love somebody as far down as I went, accept him in your life is the only answer. Without him, we've got nothing. You might think you've got it all, you've got nothing. Because everything you get today, you can't take with you. But you can take eternity with you, with Jesus. So hopefully you die when you're very old. But when you die when you're very old, everything you've built up disappears. He doesn't. And I want to be sitting at that table with you celebrating and saying, I knew you'd be here. Thank you. Keep going, people. Ask them into your life. If you don't understand the Bible, ask people who do to talk to you about it. Come to understand Jesus' love for you. And I mean it honestly from the bottom of my heart. There is no other way. He is the only way. I've tried all the other way. I've tried jails. I've tried institutions. I've tried death. There is no other answer. And I've tried where my dad's side of the family had money. We've had all that as well. None of that made a difference. But I'm telling you, get yourself down the path of Jesus and he'll bless you so much. Okay. Love your neighbour. Tell the person next to you, if there's anybody struggling that you see in university, go and be there for them. That poor person who Jesus would walk into up to on the street and be there for. Do that for them. That's love. That's love. And over all things, over the 10 Commandments and everything, what's at the top of that is love. So love your neighbour, love the people who are suffering, be there for them. And you've got it. You've got it. Accept Jesus into your life.
Great, Paul. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, your evident passion with us. If there's anything there you think, maybe that's too good to be true or too full on to be true, come and chat with him. It's also a great question to ask, because we're shortly just going to be reading a bit of the Bible and spending our next time in that, where really we're looking at the resurrection that Paul mentioned, and this is the one on which it hinges, whether this is true or whether it's something you can discard. But Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. God bless.
Just reflecting on what Paul's been sharing with us. I mean, I think for so many of us, it can be difficult to relate to that specific situation. I know for me, I know for so many of us, we can relate to that idea of addiction and the power it can have over us. And yet to hear about the freedom that Paul and so many others have found in Jesus from a power far greater than addiction is something that captivates my heart, and it's what I'm living for. I love that. So guys, we're going to be reading from John's Gospel right now. Under your seats, you should have a copy of John's Gospel. So if you want to get that out and read with us, that would be great.
And when you've got hold of that, we're on page 61. It is right at the end. We're reading from chapter 20, from verse 20 to 31. So that's page 61 down at the bottom. After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. And again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe."
A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this last evening of Vision. If this is your first evening with us, you're enormously welcome. I hope that it's already been something that's been thought-provoking, that's been fun. The band were brilliant, staggering story to hear from Paul, and I hope that you find what comes now something that's interesting, that's compelling, that maybe really makes you think. If you've been with us all week, thank you so much for giving up your time. It's been lovely to get to know some of you here in Durham, just over the lunches, the afternoons, the evenings. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here. And again, we hope that this is a really fitting conclusion to all of our time together. I want to ask you what you would say is the greatest lie in history. It feels in our current sort of post-truth day almost like those are accumulating almost by the hour. But if you were to make a bit of a list of the things that are right up there with the sort of greatest whoppers, and by greatest I don't mean like the most well-crafted lies, I mean like the really big ones, the destructive ones, I wonder what you would say. I remember one of the ones that had the most shock in terms of its impact on me was actually the day I arrived in Durham. So you cast your mind back to September 2003. Maybe you can't cast your mind back quite that far if you weren't fully around then. But I was arriving in Durham, one of the very few who came down to Durham from Scotland, and I was in Cuffs. So I was on my way to Cuffs. We land, as it were. We go to the Bailey, go to the offices, and I find out that I'm not living on the Bailey at all. I've been told it was a Bailey college. I then am given an address. This is pre-sat-nav, so we're sort of shown a map, and you think, gosh, I hope the scale on that map is wrong. It turns out I was living, along with 59 others, up near the hospital, if any of you know where that is. A significant chunk of distance away. I'm glad someone finds it funny. We went on an expedition, a little band of kind of misfits and really angry people, and we discovered that just around the corner was a sign that said Durham, 1.5 miles. So, you know, welcome to Durham Uni. There you are, thinking you're a Bailey College, you're miles away. I mean, could have been the hill, right? But it was all right. There we are. It's my last night. I'm going big and I'm going home. So it's there we go. And applause. Look at this. People are excited. That's a silly one. I had a lovely time. I loved my full 3 years. I loved my first year, even though I lived with a slightly renegade crew up there. But there are real lies, aren't there, in history that cause absolute destruction. We could think of the big ones on political levels. Think of something like the Watergate scandal. You could think of the day-to-day lies that people tell and to those they love, that kind of like the drip, drip, drip of acid corrode and erode trust. I mean, I want to suggest to you, though, this evening, as we think about the claim that was just read for us, that Jesus rose from the dead, I want to suggest that if that is a lie, and really there's no middle ground, it's either true or false. If it is false, if it is a lie, it is the single most destructive lie that has ever been told. A guy called Paul, who wrote a chunk of what then became the New Testament, says in one of his earliest letters that if Jesus is still dead, our faith, that's the faith of Christians, is futile, empty. If Jesus is still dead, it would mean that hundreds of millions of people have lived lives of utter emptiness. Think even of the story you've heard tonight and Paul's conviction and his passion. If Jesus is dead, it would mean that that is nonsense. That would be destructive to many, certainly to me and to many others. A guy called Charles Colson, who was one of the masterminds of the Watergate scandal, he went to jail. He actually became a Christian in jail. He later on said, putting the resurrection and Watergate in conversation, said that 12 of the most powerful men in the world couldn't maintain a lie for 3 weeks. The fact that a few fishermen did for 40 years makes it remarkable, if in fact they were lying. What though if it's true? That's the question put before us tonight. That's the question that is asked in the face of death and despair. That is the claim, the assertion made on that page of John's Gospel that we just had read to us, and in fact elsewhere within the New Testament scriptures. I'm behind the speakers, so I can't tell if I'm audible, but I'm hoping that the volume can match the wind as it flaps around. Let me say that if you are here for the first time this evening, you've picked probably the best night to come. Because if there is just one question on which the whole of the Christian faith rests, like a bridge with a keystone, it is the one tonight. Is Jesus alive? Did he come back from the dead? And if you've been with us all week, and I know that it's been brilliant to have chats with a whole load of people who are thinking stuff through, but just wondering, can I really trust this Christianity? Can I trust this Jesus guy? Again, this is the best night to be here, because this is the one on which things stand or fall. I want us to look, if you would, just for a last time at these Gospels tonight. We had the end of chapter 20 read for us, but turn back a page with me to the beginning of chapter 20. And I just want us to think through this question of hope in the face of death under 3 single words. And the first one is darkness. Chapter 20 begins, you can see, in darkness. Verse 1, early on the first day of the week, that's our Sunday, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. Now, dark in John's gospel is a loaded term. You may remember all the way back Monday evening, it feels like a while ago, that the world was described as a dark place. Bad things happen in darkness throughout this account of Jesus' life. And so the fact that John is telling us this is not just a time marker that Mary was up really early, probably had a really bad night, but actually that as she arrives, things are very, very bleak. Jesus is dead. Mary Magdalene was one of his earliest followers. She was one who owed everything to the Lord, with a testimony no less remarkable and miraculous than we heard today from Paul. And she had staked everything on Jesus. Left home, left her community, had followed him, and this man had died. He'd been nailed to a cross before her eyes. We thought about that last night. Dying a traitor's death, a scandal for all to see. Now just think of any bereavement you faced. It cuts, doesn't it? And the deeper you have relied on somebody, and the more deeply you have loved them, and the more profoundly you've centered your world upon them, the more painful that cut is going to be. That's why it's dark, because death is here. And I want to suggest that even just from this line, if Jesus is dead, if death still has the last word, if it is the last enemy that is powerful, the undefeated heavyweight champion of the world because it knocks literally everyone over, if that is the ultimate reality, then darkness is the right word. We joke about death sometimes, but really we use them as coping mechanisms. Spike Milligan famously had on his gravestone, "I told you I was ill." Perhaps appropriately for anyone who had sweets tonight, here's a line from another comedian. "I hope when I inevitably choke to death on gummy bears, people just say I was killed by bears and leave it at that." And we could multiply them. People make a living out of joking at death. But really, it's like telling a joke to calm our fears. You see, Mary had lost everything. Her hopes, her dreams, her future, bound up in this man whom she had followed. The bottom had fallen out of her world. Do you notice that the poignant details? She has lingered at the tomb. When the disciples look in and they see an empty tomb, she stays behind. She can't tear herself away. She's still weeping, actually, if you cast your eyes down to verse 11. And really, this portrait of a heartbroken woman crying at the side of a grave becomes almost like a picture of humanity. Because I want to suggest to you tonight that if death is the final word, if that's it, then actually we have very few options with which to deal with it. Comedy might stave it off for a while, the sort of absurdity of A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But actually, rage or despair are probably better. Because it should not be so that loved ones suffer. And it should not be so that beauty withers and fades as the frost of the end touches it and it crumbles away. One of the most moving expressions, I think, of rage in the face of death is that by Dylan Thomas, a great Welsh poet, reflecting on the dying of his father, where he says, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." Don't just lie down and take it, but go down fighting, Thomas would say. Despair really is the close cousin of rage, though. It's just a little bit more quiet. It's certainly no less terrible. We sort of shrug our shoulders, we pretend in the face of death. But we actually close our minds to why it's so bad. On the screen behind me will appear a picture of a guy called Richard Feynman. He's a famous scientist. He was known as the Great Explainer, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. And I read one of his books, 6 Easy and Not So Easy Pieces. And if he can explain physics to someone like me, he genuinely was a brilliant teacher. Some would say one of the greatest ever. He married a lovely woman called Arlene. And recently, a biographer of his discovered a letter that he had wrote to her. It begins this way: "I have a serious affliction, loving you forever." And you can file that one away for a Valentine's card if you want for another time. It's a beautiful line, isn't it? Tragically, she died on June the 16th, 1945, after a short but loving marriage. This letter was discovered that it had been written 2 years after her death. Here's a man who believed in nothing, an avowed atheist, nothing after the grave, just get on with life rationally. Let me read a bit of it to you. It's the most heartbreaking thing I think I've ever heard. I adore you, sweetheart. I know how much you like to hear that. But I don't only write it because you like it. I write it because it makes me warm all over inside to write it to you. It is such a terribly long time since I last wrote to you. Almost 2 years, but I know you'll excuse me because you understand how I am, stubborn and realistic. And I thought there was no sense to writing. My darling wife, I do adore you. I love my wife. My wife is dead. Rich. My heart breaks reading that. I love my wife, and I hope and pray that there are people you love that much. And here is a man who would say death is the end, but who realized with painful clarity that at least in his emotions he could not live consistently with that. Because death without hope is terrible. That's where Mary's at. And I would suggest that if we say there is no resurrection, if we say there is no God, if we say this is all there is, then in the fullness of time, not many options are left open to us that are different. You know, back if we look at Mary, she's so grief-stricken in verse 12 and 13 that it seems like she doesn't even pay attention to angels who appear. They ask her why she's crying, and she says, they've taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put him. And she turns from them. Verse 14 says she saw Jesus, but she didn't realize that it was him. Here is someone in the dark. And without Christ, without Jesus, death is hopeless. But if our first word here is darkness, the second is light. And I am thrilled to say that light is just a better word. Darkness is something that seems all-enveloping, doesn't it? But the darkness is driven away. It ceases to be, even with the smallest pinprick of light. This is the very final time in John's Gospel when moments are dark. Because here, with simply one word, the darkness is driven away. Verse 16, Jesus said to her, Mary. Just one name, just one word. But it is at that word that the darkness is driven away and light dawns. She turned towards him, verse 16, and cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. She goes from standing irresolute, weeping, grief-stricken in the dark, to joyful, to at his knees, to clinging to him, so overwhelmed with relief and with joy that she is. I want to suggest to you that the light dawns in a couple of ways. There are two amazing things about this just little snapshot. The first is actually what it tells us about Jesus' love for Mary. There's a real tenderness in how Jesus deals with her. I wonder what you would do if you were the person who had beaten death. Imagine that you alone of humanity have woken up from the sleep that none have shaken off, that you alone of humanity have defeated death, the hitherto undefeated champion of the world. You're being displayed as the king of the universe, the one who is the Lord over all, the one who has unique power over all things. What would you do? Well, what Jesus does is he heals the heart of a broken woman. It's just a little model of what he would do for anyone who would trust in him. Her world has gone to less than nothing, and he restores her, changing her mourning into singing. This is the sort of king that Jesus is. This is the sort of life, we're being told, that he offers. But it's amazing for a second reason. Because it shows that here in the new life of Jesus Christ is the beginning of new life and hope for everyone who listens to his voice. It's amazing that he speaks. And there is hope for us tonight in that truth. And it is amazing that she hears and responds. For it shows that we too can listen to the voice of Jesus and know the life and the light that she enjoys. You could track through the rest of this chapter and we would see the different things that Jesus gives. He says that for all who know him and trust in him, they get to call him their brother. That's in verse 17. They get to call God their Father. They get given peace in verse 19. Peace with God and peace with each other. The promise of a new world, of a new creation, is now being made concrete in flesh and bone and pumping blood in the new life of Jesus Christ. Last night, Ellie shared powerfully of her own story of hope in suffering. And she mentioned a verse where we're told that God himself one day will wipe away every tear from every eye. That the world will be renewed, a place with no more sickness or mourning or crying or pain. Because God says the old order of things, the old order that ends in the cemetery or the funeral home, the old order which ends with "and he or she died" as the epitaph, that order is passing away. And here is the first dawning of a bright new day. And this is a really inappropriate illustration on a night like this when the rain's hammering down on the tent. But you know those miserable kind of instant barbecues you can buy for $5? Maybe you take them down to the sands or something, hoping for a good meal, but you end up with just a kind of half-cooked burger because they don't burn properly. Well, on those ones, you've got that touch paper, don't you? That paper that you light in one corner, and the flame spreads to take up the whole thing. The resurrection of Jesus is the first spark on the touch paper of a new world. And it is the first flickerings of a light that will never be extinguished, the Bible says, which will cover to expand all things, swallowing up even death itself. And that offer is there for anyone who responds like Mary, who says, "Yes, Lord." But I'm very, very conscious that a description of a perfect world brought about through the new life of someone who beats death, expressed in the confidence of a friend like Paul, may well sound just too good to be true. I really get it. You know, we would say, mightn't we, from a scientific perspective, well, dead people stay dead. From a philosophical perspective, we might say, well, it's incoherent to believe in a God who can bend the laws of nature that way. And if that's you, please come and chat with me, or anyone. We'd love to knock it around in more detail. But if that is you, let me encourage you to turn the page and meet a character who can give us all hope. You see, if there is a new hope, if there is light in Jesus, our third and final word for this evening is confidence. Because Thomas, gone down in history as Doubting Thomas, is a guy I am really pleased is in the Bible. You see, Thomas refuses to believe just on the word of the disciples that Jesus is alive. They have said to him, verse 25 at the top of page 62, "We have seen the Lord." But Thomas just sounds like the first modern, doesn't he, in many ways? He says, "No, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Thomas knows dead people stay dead. We cannot say, therefore, of the first century, well, they believed in stuff like resurrection. They really didn't. You know, they know that the mortality rate is 100% always, and it stays that way. Those stats do not fluctuate and flicker. And so Thomas says, "Give me evidence. I demand hard proof." Now, his proof that is given to him is that which he asks for. It's Jesus himself. And for anyone who is a doubter like Thomas, I hope you can be comforted that Jesus does not disqualify us on the grounds of asking questions. That's really good news, or I'd be in trouble. Because show me a Christian who doesn't have doubts, and I'll show you someone who's not thinking. But there is evidence that is good, historical, and I would really want to press trustworthy. I just want to run through it. It's going to be quite rapid, but it's worth doing because actually, if you're like Thomas, I owe it to you to try and say, no, look, there really is some evidence. There are a few facts that all historians agree, even the most skeptical, that few facts that all agree must be true. First, that Jesus was executed by crucifixion in Jerusalem. That's attested to by non-Christian sources. Second, that Jesus really died and was buried. You could go back into the account of his death in verse 19 to see the medical evidence that Jesus was dead. You know, some say that he just swooned. Some say that Jesus went into a coma and was put in the tomb, and he came out after the cool revived him. But the witnesses are unequivocal. He was really dead. And just think logically for a moment. I mean, the Romans were really, really good at killing people. It's what they did, especially when it came to crucifixion. There was a full structure laid out. And at the end, they came to stab a spear in your side to accelerate it. That's what happened to Jesus. Or they would sometimes break the legs of the victim to make them die more quickly. If we're saying that Jesus only swooned or went into a coma, we have to say some other things as well. We have to say that the proper battering he was given, like Paul said, I'm going to use that again at some point in the future, the proper battering he received didn't stop him getting up. That carrying his own cross didn't stop him getting up. That being hung on his own body weight such that his lungs filled with his own fluid and started to drown him didn't stop him getting up. That a spear being thrust into his side didn't stop him getting up. And then he had 3 days in a tomb without food or drink in that physical state, rolled a stone away and fought off the guard that had been placed there. I mean, that takes way more faith to believe than that he came back from the dead, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, do come and tell me if you think that is ridiculous. Third, everyone agrees that the tomb really was empty. However you explain it, there was an empty tomb. Again, that claim is attested by non-Christian sources historically. Literally, that these Christians say that Jesus rose from the dead. All the authorities would have to do was to produce a body, end of Christianity. But nothing was ever brought. Some therefore say, well, the disciples must have stolen it. But there are two problems with that. First, they too would have had to have fought off a guard, but more critically, they would have to have a really good reason for doing so. But it is not for another 300 years that there is any point in being a Christian. You know, we sometimes say that Christianity is just about power. For the first 3 centuries of its existence, Christianity was about weakness, being persecuted, and being a minority. 11 of the 12 original apostles died for saying that Jesus rose. There was no vested interest in stealing his body in order to create a religion. It's only when Constantine becomes a Christian in 312 AD that you might think of a world where that is feasible. The atheist historian Michael Grant says this, that the historian cannot justifiably deny the empty tomb. So the question then is left. If the tomb really is empty, Jesus really died and was buried, what happened? Crucially, what happened to jumpstart the Christian faith? Because within 30 years, there are enough Christians in Rome for the Emperor Nero to say that the Great Fire of Rome was caused by them. Something happened to do that. Let me press even harder. Something happened to create overnight a coherent view of the world that was totally different to anything that had ever been seen before. You see, if you were a Jewish background person, someone with a Hebrew mindset, the idea of an individual coming back from the dead had never been suggested before. Either you believed there was no resurrection, like the Sadducees, you just believed in the first 5 books of the Bible, or you believed that everyone on the last day who believed in God would be raised from the dead. If you weren't from a Hebrew background, you would have been from a Greco-Roman background. And whoever you were from that worldview, you believe that the spirit and the flesh are diametrically opposed, that the body is bad and the soul is good. And no one would want to be reunited with their body after death. The Stoics said that true virtue then was found in suppressing the body and cultivating the soul. The Epicureans said, well, no, just enjoy yourself, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, we'll be released from our bodies, and then it gets really good. Again, no space for individual resurrection. And a guy called N.T. Wright, who used to be Bishop of Durham, then was Professor of New Testament Studies in St. Andrews, has taken ages to show that there was no space for individual resurrection. In fact, he goes so far as to say this: the early Christians did not invent the empty tomb and the meetings or sightings of the risen Jesus. Nobody was expecting this kind of thing. No kind of conversion experience would have invented it, no matter how guilty or forgiven they felt, no matter how many hours they pored over the scriptures. Some say it must have been a mass hallucination, but science has shown that doesn't happen, because in another document, 500 people claim to have seen the risen Jesus at once. Here's his conclusion. To suggest that it's invented, he says, is to stop doing history and to enter a fantasy world of our own. Now, note what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that all that evidence means that you must accept that it's true. You've got to ask whether their witness is trustworthy. I am saying that if you wish to be someone who is going to reject the claim of the resurrection with the hope that it brings, if you want to do that with intellectual honesty, with humility, you need to engage with those facts. And I'd really gently suggest you need to come up with a better alternative. Because in the face of that historical evidence, to say dead people don't rise and I'm not going to engage is essentially the equivalent of just sticking our fingers in our ears and going, nah, nah, nah. And I genuinely don't want to be childish, but that evidence is strong. One last thing before we come to an end. It's worth noticing who the first witness to the resurrection is. It's a woman. Now, in our day and age, we might say, big deal. But in the Jewish world, a woman's testimony was not allowed in a court of law. Here we see the immense dignity that Jesus affords women. In every single one of the gospel accounts of his resurrection, women are the first witnesses. I put it to you that if you wanted to create a religion, you would not choose as your first witnesses someone who would be laughed at by the world around you. Let's just say you wanted to start a new movement, the movement of ethical investment bankers. Okay? They do exist, I absolutely promise you. But imagine you wanted to start a club for them. And you said, I know, we need some really credible propaganda to get us up and running, something that really is going to work. I suggest you would not get anyone involved with the financial crash of 2008 and 9. You would not get someone whose testimony was incredible, unbelievable. You would only do that. You would only include this in an eyewitness account if it was true. Because otherwise, it would just be binned. So the question then is, who do you say Jesus is? And the question asked of you is the question really that Jesus asked Thomas. In fact, you'll notice if you look down, I mean, mine's on the floor, but if you look down, it's not a question, is it? It's a command. He says, stop doubting and believe. Now, the really wonderful news for us tonight then comes from verse 30 and 31. You see, Thomas believes because he sees. Jesus says, blessed are you who believe and have not seen. And then John says, what you have in your hands now is enough to believe in Jesus, to trust that he is the Son of God, to be humble and to follow the facts, the evidence to their conclusion. Not because that's an intellectual game, but because he is who he says he is. Because hope exists in the face of death. You see, because, and I'm going to stop using the word if, because Jesus rose from the grave, he holds out his hand and says to anyone, to Paul in his mess, to me in my mess, and to you in your mess and grief, he holds out his hand and says, come with me. Because he alone has smashed the wall of death. He alone has gone through from darkness into light. But that path remains open for any who would follow, simply by believing, by trusting, by giving yourself over to Jesus. Some fear that believing means you've got to be 100% confident. But, let me say that what you're embarking on if you trust in Jesus is a relationship. And in all of our relationships, in all of them, we actually work on the grounds of having enough confidence, not having full confidence. I'm married to Mariah. 13 and a half years ago, she placed this ring on my finger and I placed one on hers. When we said to each other, I do, did we know fully how much we loved each other? Did I know comprehensively her love for me? Lucky man that I am, I didn't. I found that out each day over the last 13 and a half years, and I hope I will continue to do so until the day I die. I knew enough, though, to trust her. And hopefully you can see my point. You may have questions like Thomas. You may have doubts like me. You may have sufferings like Paul. You may have questions like every single one of us. But the resurrection says you can take all of those things to Jesus, and he will take them from you and walk with you through them because he lives. Now, it may be that simply feels too far away from you, that you have more questions. And let me say, if that's you, please keep asking them. The guy shortly will tell us about the search, a great way from Monday you can keep on finding out more. You may want to go to a church and see what it's like. There's no price to be there, just simply see what these Christians believe in more detail. But it may well be that there is someone this evening who does believe, who hears the comfort of a risen Savior, who sees the hope of life after death with him, and who is ready to entrust yourself to him now. As I've done all week, I'm simply going to finish with a prayer with zero desire to manipulate. If this is not for you, you mustn't join in. And I'd love to talk to you afterwards if you want to talk. But if you do want to pray, this prayer is the gateway into light rather than darkness, and into life rather than death. I'll just say it, and if you want to echo it, please do quietly in your heart. Dear God, I thank you that Jesus Christ, your Son, has defeated death. I thank you, therefore, that I can know that he has dealt with my sin through his death on the cross. And thank you that he offers me the life that is his. Please help me to know the life that he offers and to follow him all of my days on this earth and on into eternity. For I ask it in his living name. Amen. Let me say that if you have prayed that prayer, I or any of the team here would love to talk with you, just to welcome you into a new day and to help you begin the first steps of following Jesus. And as I've said, if not, please come and chat, keep the conversations going, and these guys will tell us how. Thank you for listening so patiently. Thanks for listening so patiently all week, and I really hope to chat with many of you afterwards. Cheers.